Okay, hello everybody. Welcome back. Here we are, after a long break. So we were on money and the interest rates, and we're talking about the history of money. Last time we're here. So that was 11. And we got up to World War I, and just after World War I. All right, so in the distant past, there was commodity money. Eventually, that turned into metallic money, which isn't quite a line between the two, right? Metallic money is just a commodity money where that commodity isn't used that much. Let's see if I can turn this down a little bit. Does that help? Maybe. So it's not used in daily life that much. We had some examples. You can debase the currency, how governments use printing of money as a way to tax people, the development of banknotes, and then the gold standard, which is just we're all using paper money, but we can turn it in for a metallic money whenever we want. So we're still really thinking of ourselves in terms of metallic money. We're just using these notes as a convenience to avoid having to carry around the metallic thing or the jade or whatever it is. Right? And again, just to be clear, the UK was on a silver standard, but we still call it the gold standard. It's saying there's some real physical thing somewhere, and you can trade your notes in for it whenever you want. Okay. Talked briefly about bimetallism, and then we are at Germany's hyperinflation. So up till this point, every country, except for a few times during wars, was on some version of the gold standard or metallic money for human history. In human history, up till that point, except for a few weird cases for just a couple of years, every country everywhere was using some kind of physical money. Even if they were actually trading around paper, that was standing in for the physical money. And you could switch your paper for the physical money. And after World War II, after World War I, everybody except Germany went back on the gold standard and based their currency on something physical in a vault somewhere, except for Germany. And Germany had just paper money. We have it next, which is called fiat money. We'll get to it in a minute. But it's just paper, right? It's basically monopoly money. That monopoly money has value because we all agree to the rules of the game when we start playing Monopoly, and we imbue it with value. We accept it as our rents and all of that because that's the game we're playing. And the same thing with this German money. People used it just because they thought they could pass it on to somebody else. But then the government had a great need to pay off its debts. And so it would print loads and loads and loads of these notes. By doing so, it's using seigniorage. It's appropriating some of the wealth of the country by doing that. Right? Just like if you had a printing press for euros and you printed off a bunch of them, you could go out and buy stuff. That's stuff that other people wouldn't have. Right? If you go out and buy a Lamborghini with the money you just printed off, you've got a Lamborghini, and that Lamborghini didn't go to someone else. Right? And it does this because when you go in to buy the Lamborghini prices go up, and therefore someone else can't afford the Lamborghini. And this happened with Germany. Germany was printing loads and loads of Deutschmarks, that's monopoly money. Right? They are printing them. They were going out and buying stuff. That meant the price of that stuff went up. The government got the stuff rather than people. But as the price of the stuff is going up, that's inflation. And they got huge levels of inflation, thousands of percent. And this kind of destroyed society, led to the rise of a dictator and all of that, World War II and whatnot. And so this was a horrific thing that happened. And this was exactly what people were worried about in the first place. Why they all went back to the gold standard after every war is that they're thinking, look, if it's just paper, it's just paper. There's no reason people have to accept it. There's no reason for it to have value. And so things are going to get out of hand, and we're going to have hyperinflations and zombie apocalypse and all of that, which is exactly what happened in Germany. Right. All right, so everyone's back on the gold standard after World War. Okay. So that was the post-World War I situation. And then, of course, rise of a dictator and all that would go into World War II. And in World War II, everyone has need for money, and they all go off the gold standard. right? Because they need the seigniorage to pay for the tanks and the ships and the bombs and all of that stuff that war entails. And so we go back to everyone just printing money, but it's understood that this is for the duration of this crisis, right? And it's a wartime, people are kind of good with it, there are not many goods to buy anyway. The governments are reasonably careful about this and no disaster happens, although there was inflation. And we get through World War II. Okay? Same way we got through World War I, the Crimean War, and all those. You know, they go off the gold standard, but they go right back on at the end. So at the end of World War II, we say, okay, well, world's in chaos. It's rubble everywhere. Now we have to set up a financial system so that things are stable in the future. And one thing that they did learn from World War I is that these punitive punishments on the loser don't work, right? Because it causes a crisis in that country, it leads to instability, and terrible things happen. They're saying, look, we need to create a stable world system where financially there's no crises and stuff. And we know that if there's not a gold standard, you're going to get hyperinflation, a disaster, rise of a dictator, and another world war. So let's not do that this time. Let's all go on the gold standard. Okay? Now, one of the troubles they had, though, is they couldn't all go on the gold standard. They couldn't just do it because during the war, Europe and many other countries were devastated by war. Their industry wasn't working very well. They're being bombed and whatnot. And so during the war, they had to buy stuff from countries whose economies weren't devastated. And that was primarily the US, other countries as well. But they were buying tons of stuff from the US. The US was producing bombers and tanks and all that, guns and all that stuff, and food as well. And so Europe was largely surviving on the stuff made. We're going to pretend it's just America. I know Brazil and whatnot exists, but we're going to ignore you guys. Right? They're relying on stuff made in the US. And so huge amounts of gold and silver were used to buy that stuff. And so during the war, stuff is coming from the US to Europe, and gold, silver is going from Europe to the US. So by the end of the war, the United States has the vast majority of all the world's gold in a big vault. And they said, well, where are we going to put all this gold that we got during the war? We're going to put it in someplace safe. Let's make a big vault like in the middle of a military base. And that way it's going to be very hard to steal it. And so they put it in a fort. They put it in Fort Knox. And this is where Fort Knox becomes a thing. From every movie where they rob Fort Knox is post-World War II, where all that gold ended up in Fort Knox. Right? And Fort Knox became synonymous with storing huge amounts of gold, was just this. They collected all the world's gold, or I can't remember the percentage, but it's a huge percentage. It's well over 50% of the world's gold. It's nearer to 100% than to 50%, but I forget the particular number. Huge amount of the world's gold. And so there we are in the new world. We say we have to have a gold standard, but the US is the only one with any gold of any measurable amount, right? Any important amount that we could actually do this. So you think about the UK, we don't want to be Germany. We don't want to go into a hyperinflation after World War II. We would like to be on the gold standard. We don't have any gold. We don't have any silver. What do we do? Well, the first thing they could do is they could go to their friends. They had a special relationship, you know. We go to the Americans and say, President Truman, could you just give us some gold and then we'll be fine and we can do the gold standard thing and that will stabilize the economy. But you may have noticed in your travels that if there's people sitting on a giant pile of gold, you've probably met them on the street, they don't just hand it out willy-nilly to people. They don't give it back. It's just not a thing. And so, okay, there was the Marshall Plan and all that, but by and large, they're not giving all the gold. They gave stuff, and actually they sold the stuff. So the US isn't going to give back all the gold. You say, we got it fair and square. We provided you stuff, you gave us gold, now it's ours. Suck it, right? And so there we are. Nobody has any gold except for the US. The US is the only one that can go onto the gold standard. But the US doesn't want a new hyperinflation in Europe again because they already fought 2 world wars there. They don't want a third. And so how can we stabilize the European economies? We're going to come up with a clever scheme. And it's going to be a clever scheme that doesn't involve giving anyone gold, because we're not doing that. That's out of the question. And so what they're going to do is they get all of the finance ministers, I think they get 33 or 44 finance ministers from around the world, and they take them to a fancy resort. It's on the east coast of the US, fancy resort called Bretton Woods. And they make an agreement at Bretton Woods, eating shrimp and lobster, probably lots of lobster. It's New England. So they're eating loads of lobster, and they're kind of sick on the lobster, and they make this agreement. And this is back in the day, right? And back in the day, the great and the good could come into a room, and well, the great and the pretend to be good could come into a room, and they could say, here's how we're going to set up the world. And that kind of happened. And this was sort of the last time where that was really a thing, just after World War II, where they could get, 40 people in a room and decide how the world works, right? And so they do that. They go to Bretton Woods, they get all the shrimp, they eat all the lobster, and they decide how the world's going to work after World War II. And this is what they come up with. This is obviously simplified, right? The world is more complicated. What they decide is that the US is going to go on to the gold standard. So if you take a US dollar, you bring it into the treasury, they were going to give you so much gold. And if you bring in gold, they're going to give you so many dollars. And you can just switch them back and forth. But gold's a pain to deal with, so everyone's going to actually be using the paper money. But it's going to be worth gold. Right? They're on the gold standard. Everything's good. UK, France, Germany, they got a problem. And so what they're going to do is they're going to go on to a fixed exchange rate system. It's a little bit more complicated, but a fixed exchange rate system is basically saying, let's say, take the US and the UK. They agree, US is on the gold standard. UK can't be on the gold standard because they don't have the gold or the silver. And so what they have to do is they make this agreement with the US that we bring in, give a pound sterling, and you'll give us $4. And bring us $4, we'll give you a pound sterling. And so they make this exchange between these paper monies at a fixed rate. And both the US and the UK, they agree to sort this out. And what this means is that the UK can't just print loads and loads of money, because then everyone would take that money. If there was loads of British pounds around, people would take those British pounds and get dollars, right? Because there's loads of them. They're easy to come by. And so that kind of constrains the amount of pounds that they can print, so that they're in this agreement with the US, and that they agree together that we're going to meet every year, and we're going to decide how many pounds you print, and how many francs you print, how many Deutschmarks you print, and we're all going to, as a gentleman, we're gentlemen here. No women in the room, obviously. But we're all gentlemen here. Well, I don't know, some of them were probably ladies, but they were dressed up as gentlemen. So they made this agreement. We're all going to play nice together, and we're going to agree each year how much of each thing you print, so that we can have this exchange rate. And so if a lot of people come to the French and say, I want US dollars, the Americans agree to supply them with some dollars. The French obviously can't print US dollars, but the Americans say, it's okay, we'll give you dollars if you're playing along nicely with this agreement. And if people come to the Americans and say, we want to get francs, the French agree to provide them francs. And because we're all cooperating here in this nice Bretton Woods agreement at a fancy resort, we can do this because we're all playing nice with each other, and we agree to help each other out when we're short of dollars or we're short of francs or whatever. And we agree to do this. And that means for a person in the UK, they can say, well, the UK pound, it's a British pound, not backed by anything. There's no actual thing. But the British can't just print loads and loads of pounds, right? They can't get into the hyperinflation that Germany got into, just printing more and more, because they're in this agreement, and that would screw up the agreement, right? And so you can say, okay, the British pound, they're not going to print lots of them. And if I want, I can go in to the British central bank, to the exchequer there at the time, go into the exchequer, I can take in my British pound, and they will give me dollars. And then I can take my dollars and give it to the Americans, and they'll give me gold. Right? So it's not that UK is on the gold standard, but I can still convert my British pounds through these torturous steps, into gold. Right? And then, of course, the Irish, just as an aside, the Irish went onto a fixed exchange rate with the British pound. And so then you could exchange British pounds for Irish pounds at a rate. Then you could take your British pounds and you could switch them over with the American dollar. You take the American dollar and switch it into gold. And so we are indirectly on the gold standard as well, right, in those days. So vast majority of the countries go on into this Bretton Woods agreement. 44 is a fairly large number, vast majority. A third of the countries go into this agreement, and they're effectively on the gold standard through this convoluted way that involves everyone playing nice with each other and agreeing every year and that sort of thing. All right, why is that there? Okay, I'm missing something, okay. Now, of course, not everybody is in this agreement, where we only had the 44 finance ministers. There's like 150 countries. What about those other guys? First of all, they're unimportant. Right? This is back in the day when we could say, you people are less valuable than our people. I guess we still do that, but we could do it more explicitly back in those days. And so those countries, screw them. They're not in the agreement. They're not important. We don't care about them. But then people start thinking, this is a bit of a problem, because collectively that's most of the world's population. And if they're unstable, we're doing this whole thing to make the world a stable place financially, right? If they're unstable, that's going to leak over to the good countries. Just saying. And so maybe we should do something to help them be stable as well. Now, we can't have 150. Some of them are whack jobs. Okay, some of us are whack jobs too. But we're used to our whack jobs, and so we're not used to their whack jobs. And so we don't really want them in our club. But what we're going to do is we are going to set things up so that it is nice for them to play along and not have hyperinflation themselves. And the way we do this is we set up an organization called the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. And that's a big pot of money, basically, with alternating leadership between the US and Europe, going back and forth, flip a coin. And their job is to sit on this pile of money and say, if you're a country that's playing nice with this financial system, with this Bretton Woods agreement, you're not having hyperinflation, you're trying to do things nicely, you're trying to do whatever it is we deem the prudential thing to stabilize the world economy, and that changes over time. Right? But if you're doing that, if we like you in a sort of a financial sense, then if you get into trouble, we've got this pot of money to help you out. Right? And we can give you loans, almost always loans. We can even give you gifts, rarely. But we can do this, and that will help you out if you get into a temporary disaster sort of situation. And so the IMF is set up specifically to support this Bretton Woods system. That is its goal, to get all the other countries that aren't part of the agreement to play nicely with it so that we have a stable financial system in the world. Right? All right. Now, as time goes on, all these gentlemen's agreements, when you meet the guys, they're not that much a gentleman, and so there's problems, right? There's problems in these things, and there's various crises as we go along, and things are difficult, and they have to readjust the rates, and we're going to see, instead of four British pounds to $4 to 1 British pound, we're going to change it to $3 per 1 British pound, and they've got to adjust these things. It's difficult, but it's kind of working, right? So for 25 years, it's limping along, reasonably working. Okay. And then we get to 1972. And in 1972, the US is in the Vietnam War. Wars, as always, are expensive. And as always, Johnson had come up with the Great Society program, where they're spending lots of money on social programs, and plus they're fighting this war. They got lots of expenses. They want to run some inflation. Right? They want to increase the number of US dollars out there, but they're on this gold standard, and they could adjust it. They could debase the currency. But this Bretton Woods had been kind of limping along for a while, and they keep trying to patch it up and patch it up. And Nixon just woke up one day on that side of the bed and said, nope, we're off the gold standard. It's done. And he just said, US isn't on the gold standard. So this whole Bretton Woods agreement was predicated, the whole world financial order was predicated on the US being on the gold standard. Right? And then, all of a sudden, one morning, it wasn't. Right? And they can just print as much or as little money as they want. Okay? It's just monopoly money. You can print more, you can print less. It's totally up to you. Whatever you want to do. You don't have to have anything in the fort. We still got the money in the fort, the gold in the fort, but you don't need it there, right? You can just print as much or as little as you want. And that happened in 1972 or 73, I forget which one. And so all of a sudden, And this is what, 50 years ago, right? 50 years ago, the entire history of money gets thrown out the window, right? Up until that point, money meant something physical. They made convoluted ways to get to it and all that, but it meant something physical, which meant that you couldn't create as much as you want. The one time when it didn't mean something physical was an absolute disaster. And then overnight, on one particular day, the whole world, the vast majority of the industrialized world goes off the gold standard, and their money is just monopoly money. Never happened before in history, except the one disaster time. Okay, it's not in any major wars, not a crisis. You can't say, well, we're going to go back after the crisis. It just is off the gold standard, and money for the world on that day becomes monopoly money. Okay. This is 50 years ago, right? So we have, what, 4,000 years of human history with physical monies, and we have 50 years of human history with this monopoly money thing, what's called fiat money. It's money that just, if you have like judicial fiat, it means that the judge just decides and the judge told us the way it is. And this is money that's just money because the government says so. Okay? It's not money because there's something physical, real, or anything like that. It's just, it has value because they say so and we believe them. Okay? Never before happened in human history, and now everybody's on it overnight. Okay? And there's been some troubles in the last 50 years, but so far, kind of, so good. But it is genuinely early days. Like, we have not had a world conflict since that time. Right? We've had a few ups and downs, but we haven't had any major crises since that time. And we have no idea, honestly, what's going to happen when we do. Right? Because, again, never before in human history has this happened. 4,000 years, we got 50 years of this. Okay? It is super new. And this is, I know, how all of us were raised. Okay, I had 5 years in gold standard as a youth, and I was watching Batman, Adam West, the real one. I was watching that. That was my extent, right? But it didn't register to me. All of my adult life and all of your lives have been spent with fiat money. We're used to it. We think it's normal. It is not normal. It is super new. We do not know how it's going to work out. Okay? Good luck to us. We don't know. So far, so good, but we don't know. Yeah?
Can you argue that right now it's not so good so far?
Oh, sure.
Just because the money's become inflating a lot more,
Mm-hmm.
and university tuitions, at least in the U.S., are rising.
Yeah. That's possibly a separate issue. That's because economics professors are greedy, I think.
But it coincides with getting onto the gold standard.
Yeah. I mean, you can definitely argue that it's not going well. What I mean by it's going okay is that we haven't had a repeat of society disintegrating in major countries. We have in Zimbabwe, right? It's not like it doesn't happen, but in that sense, we're muddling through. Now, it's also true that in the gold standard, it wasn't painless either. There was issues with that. But you're right. You can definitely make that argument, and people do make that argument, right? It is like, we got our troubles. It's not like we don't. And some of these troubles are based on governments can just print as much money or as little money as they want. So you're right. You could definitely make that case.
Is it primarily Austrians?
So, yeah, people love to put things into categories, and that's what we do. Especially in macroeconomics, we have a tendency to make camps. They're very territorial, the macroeconomists. So the Austrian school of macroeconomics is libertarian and thing, and they're very much against central banks, which is an institution that we're going to talk about now, and very much in favor of the gold standard. They're definitely a minority in the macroeconomics community, like a very small minority, but as at one point Einstein came up with his general relativity theory, right? And they got 100 physicists to sign a letter saying it was rubbish. And Einstein said, if I was wrong, they'd only need one. Right, so it's not a popularity contest. It is what it is, but yeah, it was generally associated with Austrian school, which is just because it's called the Austrian school just because of a couple of Austrian refugees in the U.S. were the big guys, like von Hayek and stuff, back in the day. Okay, so now we've got fiat money. And fiat money is valuable, not because there's anything behind it, but just because other people think it's valuable. I accept money from you because I think people will accept it from me. And they accept it from me because they think someone else will accept it from them. That's the only reason it has value. Yeah. Okay. So at this stage, like this is something that happened, and it's just because we're well, European-ish here, right? We're going to talk a little bit about what happened in Europe in that time. And what happened in Europe in that time is everyone freaked out. Well, not everyone, not people, but economists and finance ministers and these sort of people, like not humans, but these sort of people freaked out because they were aware that this is something that had never happened in human history, and it wasn't happening because they wanted it to happen, right? Nixon wanted it to happen, but now Europe is off the gold standard, and they say, okay, the US is nuts. You can see it goes back a while, this US is nuts thing. And they did this thing. We don't have the gold. We can't go on the gold standard. But what we can do is we can continue cooperating with each other. Nixon tore up Bretton Woods, but let's create our own club. And in this club, we don't have the gold to back it, but we can agree together not to have hyperinflation. Particularly Germany is driving this because Germany has some terrible experience with hyperinflation, and they don't want their neighbors having hyperinflation because they don't want another world war either, and they don't want to have it themselves. And so let's all get in this together and sort something out, come up with a way to avoid this kind of disaster. Okay? And this is the creation of the European monetary system, the EMS. A long defunct, little goofy system. You could not set up a goofier system if you tried, honestly. But the European monetary system is saying, okay, we don't have any gold to back this stuff, but let's continue this Bretton Woods style of getting together and agreeing and having a fixed exchange rate between us, even though there's no gold. And so they say, 1 British pound is worth 5 Deutschmarks, and so many francs, and so on. And they even create, if I have it here, this thing, the European currency unit, the ECU, which was a big thing back in the day. So from 1970 to 1992, it was a big deal. So 20 years it was a big deal. And what it was is they said, let's make a basket. Obviously, we're economists, we love baskets. Little Red Riding Hood syndrome, we call it. So we got a basket, and in it we put a British pound, a few French francs, a few Deutschmarks, and so on and so forth. We put these currencies in a basket, and we say that this basket of currency is a European currency unit. And we are going to set the price for this. We're going to say this basket of currencies has to be worth 2 British pounds, and it's got to be worth 8 Deutschmarks, and it's got to be worth so many French francs, right? And we keep just pricing this basket and seeing how much it's worth. And if it's worth less than the 2 British pounds, then we need to print some more British pounds so that it's worth that amount of British pounds. And we all agree, we meet every year, we try to keep inflation under control. Mostly the Germans try to make us keep inflation under control for the historical reasons. And we keep adjusting the amount of money that we have in the economy in a mechanism that we'll get to later. But we keep doing that to try to keep this European currency unit at a particular price. We're trying to mimic the Bretton Woods Agreement as best we can, even though there's not a gold backing anything. We can't have the gold, we're just doing the best we can. And this was moderately okay. I mean, there were endless crises with the European monetary system. They were always like readjusting the numbers, and every few years they'd have to readjust things. They had more trouble with it than they had with the Bretton Woods, which was not perfect by any means. But it kind of limped along until 1992. Okay. All right. And what happened in 1992 was we had a speculative attack against this thing. So Sweden was part of the deal. Right? So here's the 1992. Now we're getting into details here, right? This was the broad strokes up to here. Now I'm getting a little bit more detailed just because it's a little closer to now. And some of the people are still alive and kicking and in the news, and so it's worth knowing. So in 1992, I think in August, the finance guys, the speculators in Sweden said, okay, 1 krona is worth so many Deutschmarks. But we think that they're going to have to adjust this thing. They're going to have to adjust this European monetary unit. They're going to have to adjust the prices. And so at the moment, it's one krona per, so let's do it 1-to-1. It wasn't, but this was 1 krona per Deutschmark. You trade them 1-to-1. It's not really the number, but tomorrow, I think it's going to be 2 krona per Deutschmark. I think they're going to adjust it. And so what do? Well, you borrow as much as you can in krona. You buy Deutschmarks. You wait a day. Woohoo, you doubled your money, right? So this is what they all did. Like everybody and their brother, not like normal people, but finance guys and traders and investment houses and pension funds, all these guys, they borrowed as many krona as they possibly could. They turned them into Deutschmarks. Now they're paying an interest rate on borrowing all that money, but if there's a devaluation, if they readjust the prices between krona and Deutschmarks overnight, they're going to double their money, right? And so they all do this, and then the monetary authorities in Sweden had to decide, what are they going to do? Are they going to adjust the prices, or are they just going to let it ride and let these guys lose money? And the trouble with this is that interest rates, overnight interest rates, were 500% per year for a couple of days there. So you can imagine, like that's a really high interest rate. We're used to saying I'll pay 5% on my right? If I borrow money for a car, I'll pay 5%, 6%. It was 500%, right? So these guys were borrowing money only for a day at 500% interest rate, and the Swedish central bank decided not to devalue, and all these guys lost the interest money, and they gave up in August. Hey. European monetary system limps along for another day. That's gorgeous. And then a month or so later, the exact same thing happens in the UK. Okay. And a bunch of guys, not normal guys, but investment trader guys, they're sitting on small amounts of money, like 100 million pounds, something like that, pittance. But they're sitting on these kinds of monies, and they start saying, okay, I think at the moment, it's 4 British pounds per Deutschmark. I think tomorrow it's going to be 8 British pounds per Deutschmark. It wasn't that extreme, but they thought it was going to devalue. And so they want to borrow pounds at the moment, hold them in Deutschmarks, and then switch them back to British pounds the next day and make a killing, right? And so a bunch of people started doing this. And so this is where George Soros becomes famous, by the way. He's the guy who's still in the news. Right? George Soros becomes famous. He was rich before, but he becomes super rich in that week. He was sort of the biggest leaders, but there were a bunch of these guys doing it. Right? So a bunch of these guys, they're borrowing money in order to buy Deutschmarks, hoping that the value of the British pound goes down and Deutschmarks becomes relatively more valuable, doubling their money overnight. Right? They're hoping on this. And interest rates start going up, because everyone's borrowing money, right? Everyone's borrowing money to buy these Deutschmarks. So the interest rates start going up. And the head of the Bank of England, the Central Bank of England, again, we'll talk about what a central bank is in a bit, but the head of the Bank of England gets out, he has a press conference, and he says, we will do whatever it takes to defend the British pound. Very strong statements, whatever it takes. Murdering babies in the street, we don't care, we're going to do it. Whatever it takes, we're going to do it. He didn't specify the babies, but whatever it takes encompasses a lot. So he makes this statement, and these guys, particularly Mr. Soros, who had a lot of friends, they said, well, it sounds like a strong statement, but if they were really that confident, they wouldn't have had to come out of their office. Right? They're coming out of the office because they're scared. They're having the press conference because they're scared. And so they're definitely going to devalue. And so he said, okay, I've been borrowing a lot up till now, but now I'm going to bet the house on it. And he takes his whole fortune and everything he can borrow and all his friends can borrow, and they buy Deutschmarks. And the thing collapsed overnight. And I can't remember the number it got up to. I think it got up to like 40, 50% interest rates. It wasn't anywhere near the 500% that we saw in Sweden, but the central bank gave up. And the whole thing fell apart. Okay? Now, the reason it was different in the UK than it was in Sweden is like these institutional things. It feels like institutional details are kind of unimportant, but they can have big effects. In Sweden, if you bought a house, you would borrow money on your house, and the custom was to have a fixed interest rate. Right? So the vast majority of people, when they borrowed money for their house, they said, we're going to be paying 5% interest per year. And so whatever happens in the financial system, their payments are fixed for the duration of the loan. Okay? Which meant when the interest rate went up to 500%, yeah, that affected some people a lot. But it was just these money guys. And these money guys, they know they're in a gambling business. You win some, you lose some. And there are very few of them. Yeah, it hurts, and they're powerful and all that, but they're just a few guys, and it's not super crucial for a politician to please them. It's nice to please them, but it's not super crucial. But in the UK, people, like in Ireland, people take out variable interest rate loans, right? So when you buy a house, you're saying, I'm going to pay. It is complicated, but I'm going to pay, say, whatever the general interest rate is between banks, the interbank rate, the rate that banks charge each other, plus some amount. Right? So when the rate that banks charge each other goes up, your home payments go up as well. And so you can imagine if there was 5% interest rate in the UK, like 90% of the people would lose their home because they couldn't afford that kind of payment. And those are voters, and those are the people who actually do vote and that politicians care about, like the homeowner guys, right? And so there was no way they were going to let interest rates get so high in the UK because every politician would be out on his butt. And so the thing fell apart, they were not able to defend it, and the whole European monetary system came crashing down. And now technically it was still around for a few years, but they made the rules so lax that it was effectively not mattering. They had goofy things. I didn't convey the goofiness of the European monetary system. Say rather than having fixed exchange rates, they had this thing called exchange rate bands, and they said, we're not going to say that the British pound is worth 4 Deutschmarks. We're going to say we're going to let it do whatever it wants, but it's going to be somewhere between 6 and 3. And we're going to have a band that it has to stay in, and if it gets to the edge of the band, we're going to start doing stuff. And whole generations of macroeconomists made their living analyzing what these exchange rate bands were like. But they're essentially just a fixed exchange rate, just super, super more complicated for no real benefit. They pretended like there was benefit, but there wasn't really. So it was super complicated, but short-lived, and now it's gone. And so now in Europe we have a problem. Now we're just all on our own. We don't have this cooperative thing anymore. I mean, we still meet because obviously the lobster is good, but there's nothing really for us to do in these meetings other than bitch at each other. And bitch they did, but in the end there's not much that you can do in those because we don't have a system for it to work in. And during the same time, Europe was coming together on other issues as well, right? They're coming together on trade between borders, they're coming together on migration, and Europe is just becoming more of a unified thing than it ever was before. And so they said, our monetary system is in shambles. We're really scared of the hyperinflation coming back. We're okay now, but we're looking forward into the future, and that's a possibility. Right? Europe hasn't had a crisis for a while, and so what happens when there is a crisis, nobody knows. And so we really want to stabilize things. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create a currency for Europe, the euro, which is the dumbest name ever. We're going to create this euro, and we're not going to put any interesting pictures on any of the bills because that would offend somebody. And we're going to have this very bland money, and that's going to be great, right? And that's where we are now. Now, I will say when they were introducing the euro, this was something new too. This was new in the world. Not unique in the world, but yeah, pretty new in the world. In the sense that almost all countries had currency that had carried over from the gold standard days. Right? The British pound, technically it's fiat currency at this stage, but it had been established when it was backed by silver. Right? And the vast majority of currencies were like that. A few South American currencies were different, but by and large, they were all historical sort of leftovers. And this money only works if you accept it. And you only accept it because you think that other people think it's money. And they only accept it because they think other people think it's money. Right? There's nothing backing it. It is just monopoly slips of paper. And if people decided not to use the euro wouldn't be money. It's all well and good the government puts their stamp on it and all, but it's just us. Either we use it as money or not. right? We have cases like German hyperinflation, where the government put its stamp on it, but nobody was using it as money. And people, you can think about the ruble. That's more recent, but still, right? People stop using the ruble and start using vodka, right? Just because the government puts its stamp on it doesn't mean we have to use it. And economists and finance ministers were super scared at the introduction of the euro. And it's before your time, but it's not that long ago when they were introducing the euro. And it was like a huge thing. They had fireworks. They had politicians standing in front of giant structures that said euro. They were like, let's introduce the new symbol, the symbol. And it was like a whole marketing brouhaha. And this was because they were really nervous that we wouldn't use it. Okay. Now, it turned out it worked out fine. People did start using it without too much trouble, but they didn't have to. And it was a real worry that they wouldn't. And in fact, initially they thought a euro should be worth $1. It should be about like that, like the dollar. But they introduced it, I think, at 1.3. The euro was worth 1.3 because they figured in that first year it was going to go down in value because nobody would want to hold it. And they wanted it to stabilize at 1 to 1. Now, it turned out it didn't drop so far, and it was quite above the dollar for quite a while. But the reason it was above the dollar is because they were scared when they were introducing it that it wouldn't work at all. Okay, now to manage the euro, they need someone decide how much to print, how many euros we're going to have out there. And that someone is the European Central Bank. Right? And all of the European stuff is all off in Brussels, except for the European Central Bank, which is off in Frankfurt. It's the one big European institution that isn't in Brussels, right? Well, why is that? It's because of the Germans. The Germans wouldn't give control of this money thing to somebody else because in all of this time, the reason the Bretton Woods Agreement was having trouble, the reason the European monetary system was having trouble was, particularly European monetary system, was a lot of countries were printing more money than they really should have, according to the Germans, right? And this is because each country has a different sort of situation. So in particular, the big culprits that in my youth when I was going to graduate school, like everyone was blaming, was Italy. Italy keeps printing more money. Italy keeps having high inflation. And the reason Italy keeps having high inflation, or did back in the day, was because first of all, they didn't have the hyperinflation experience, so they weren't scared of it the same way, like in a visceral way. But also because Italy has, how shall we say this and not offend the Italians? Italy has very brave taxpayers who are not afraid of cheating on their taxes. How we say it that way. Italy's tax system is unable to tax a lot. Right? A lot of people find ways, and it's it's the national sport to how do you avoid taxes. And so it's very difficult to raise taxes in Italy compared to Germany, where people just pay their taxes, by and large. There's embezzlement there, there's problems there too, but it's harder to raise large amounts of money in the Italian situation. Historical reasons, cultural reasons, whatever, it's harder to do it. The tax system has more ways to evade taxes there than elsewhere. Which means the government was always short of money, and the one thing that they could do was print money, right? They have the printing press, they could print money. So the Italians were always running higher inflation than the Germans. In fact, everyone was running higher inflation than the Germans, printing more money than Germans, but Italians particularly more extreme, right? And so the Germans say, I do not want Italians in charge of the money. They just print it like there's no tomorrow. We want to be in charge of the money. And if the truth be told, actually, the Italians kind of didn't mind the Germans being in charge of the money, right? Because they don't want inflation. They're just like, they got to do this thing, right? And so they're willing to give that control to somebody who wants inflation low. And so everyone, national pride and all that, but they're willing to give control to the Germans. Not total control, but a lion's share of control to the Germans. And that's why we got our European Central Bank in Frankfurt rather than with everybody else. Okay. It's a bit of a problem for economists because economists get flown out to the European Central Bank quite a lot, and they'd rather go to Brussels than Frankfurt. Frankfurt's a nice enough city, but it's not Brussels. But anyway, they have to go. Economists have to go to Frankfurt. If you're a political scientist, you get to go to Brussels, but if you're an economist, you get to go to Frankfurt. Okay. They still got the lobster though. That's the thing. Okay. So that's where we are. And the thing to take away from this in particular is how very, very, very new this is in human history. This idea of fiat money, that the money is just sort of monopoly money and it only works because we believe it works. And we only believe it works because we believe other people believe it works. That is super new in the history of the world. And everybody, just muddling through. And we're learning quite a lot. Like, if you look at monetary theory, it was pretty stable. Like, there was sort of a general theory about how money works and what countries should do to stabilize their currency and all that, up until World War II. And then it had to be modified for the New World Order, where everyone wasn't on the gold standard. And then it was fairly stable up till the end of the gold standard, up till Nixon got rid of it, 1972, 73. But since then, it has been an entire flux. Every few years, there's a whole new way of looking at things because we're feeling our way out about this. There's some experience of a particular country, and we say, well, how do we explain that? How does it fit in with what's going on? And so if you look at the last 50 years of monetary theory, there's waves of different points of view, different ways of thinking about it, a lot of new theory, a lot of new empirical stuff. It's from crisis to crisis. Macroeconomics will switch. How do we deal with this new crisis? How do we deal with this new crisis? And that's because it's all genuinely very, very new. It's all genuinely 50 years old in human history, and we're muddling through, right? And each time something comes up and say, okay, that's not working. Let's do something else. Well, that something else is new in human history, and so it has to be studied from scratch. And then that causes troubles, and we say, okay, let's do something else. And okay, well, we study that for a while, and we see how that works. Currently, we're on the Taylor rule. Our guys are talking about the Taylor rule, which is a particular way of reacting your monetary policy to external conditions, particularly unemployment and interest rates. That's the current thing. Maybe that'll last. Maybe that'll be the thing that we go on with for the next 5,000 years, or maybe there'll be some new crisis and we'll have to adapt. We don't know because it's all so new. Okay, I think next we have, I'm gonna leave it here because this is sort of a natural place to stop. And yeah, we only got 3 minutes anyway. So I'll see you next time, and yeah.